Good evening, everyone. Welcome to tonight's lecture, arranged by Center for Asian and Middle Eastern Studies. I'm your host, Naeem Mahmood. Tonight, we are to have our third lecture on the series, Crash of Civilization, the History and Future of Western Modernity, and the Islamicate. The series consists of 4 lectures, which will be delivered on a fortnightly basis. The aim of the series is to understand modernity better and how it affected the Islamicate. The title of tonight's lecture is Systematic Flaws of Modernity and its Application by the Islamicate, Political, Cultural, and Ideological Interventions. The lecturer tonight is Professor Saeed Khan. Saeed Khan is Associate Professor of Teaching in the Departments of Near East and Asian Studies and Global Studies at Wayne State University, Detroit, Michigan, where he teaches Islamic and Middle East history, politics, and culture, and where he is also Director of Global Studies. His primary area of research is the identity politics of Muslim diaspora communities in the USA, UK, and Europe, and assessment of Western modernity and its discontents. He is also a research fellow at Wayne State's Center for Study of Citizenship, and is a founding member and a research fellow at the Institute of Social Policy and Understanding, ISPU, which is a Washington-based think tank. Professor Khan's most recent publications include the 2021 anthology, Global Studies, a reader on issues and institutions, the co-authored 2020 book, What is Going On Here? US Experiences of Islamophobia Between Obama and Trump, and Fallacies of Foundational Principles, Rawls's Political Liberalism and Islamophobia, in the Reorient, March 2017. A few words about the format of tonight's lecture. We start with the introduction, which I have just done. The lecture is next, which will last around 30 to 45 minutes. The lecture will be followed by comments and Q&A section, which will last around 30 to 45 minutes as well. We observe few rules. We ask our audience to keep mic and mobile muted until told otherwise. We encourage questions and comments, maintaining professional approach. We also encourage the attendees to take notes on lectures for the comment and Q&A section. So these are the rules of tonight's lecture. Now we'll go straight to the lecture. I would like to ask Professor Saeed to go ahead with the lecture. Professor Saeed, over to you.
Thank you so much, Naeem. Good evening, good afternoon, wherever you might be. Assalamu alaikum to all of you. And thank you so much for returning to our third lecture out of 4. We will be concluding with this lecture series in a fortnight, 2 weeks from tonight. And then hopefully we will have plans for a future lecture series, which will be ones that extend from some of the themes and the topics that we discussed in this lecture series to hopefully provide some both continuity and further delving into what I hope you find to be as interesting topics and issues and challenges as do we. So tonight's lecture is going to be, and let me just go ahead and I'll share my screen here right now, if you don't mind, looking at the issue of systemic flaws of modernity. Now, let me go ahead and just give you a little bit of a thought experiment here so that we can contextualize this. And I want to thank the gentleman before for a very important question as far as defining modernity. So first of all, we are talking here in this lecture series, of course, about Western modernity. But I'd like to offer you as just an analogous situation or a parallel, looking at Islam as a project of modernity itself. If we look at perhaps the simplest definition of modernity, and I know it's probably one that's not going to be very satisfying to most people, the definition of modernity in any dictionary is essentially the state of being modern. I know that seems to be rather tautological. It seems as though it's a definition that simply defines itself. but if you'll permit me, I'll go ahead and I'll unpack that. To be modern simply means to succeed something else. The bigger question is what sustains that new project of modernity? What features does it have that allow it to then grow, achieve a certain cruising altitude, so to speak, be successful, thrive, and be beneficial to whatever society it's looking to change and improve. That, of course, is what was the impetus behind Western modernity, consciously or unconsciously. But if we take a look at, for example, Islam in the 7th century, particularly from within an Islamic narrative, we're of course taught that Islam came along as a redemptive religion, an entire system and way of life, which was now replacing something which was decrepit, bankrupt, maybe even considered to be illegitimate. This, of course, being the pre-Islamic polytheistic period of Arabia, oftentimes known as the Jahiliyyah, or the period of ignorance. The problem, though, and of course this then fits in for tonight's discussion, is depending on how we look at what Islam replaced, it takes us into completely different directions on how to then cope with it and develop strategies of dealing with it, which of course will be at the core of our next lecture in 2 weeks. If the Jahiliyyah is looked at as being simply a mirror opposite of the Islamic project, that is certainly a very common way of examining it, but it then removes a lot of the nuance and the very important subtlety of reminding ourselves that the project of Islam did not emerge in a vacuum or a void, but borrowed heavily from elements of the Jahiliyyah, which were then codified, validated, and legitimized within the Islamic project. For example, the Murawwa, the tribal ethos, which valued and prioritized wisdom, hospitality, protection of the vulnerable, courage. These, of course, would all be regarded by anybody as proper Islamic values and virtues. That is, of course, not to say that the period of the Jahiliyyah did not become dysfunctional, but it then becomes an important question to ask, was the dysfunctionality, which then rose to such a maximum and a height that required, if you will, the advent of Islam in the early 7th century, was that a systemic flaw? Were there certain features within the Jahiliyyah and the society that allowed for it to become bankrupt in the way that it did and dysfunctional? Was it something that occurred out of nothing itself? Those kinds of inquiries, I think, are very helpful then for us to assess not only how Islam then comes in as the kind of redeeming feature that it provided, but also show you how Western modernity in many ways needs to be tackled like that as well. There are those, of course, from within the Islamicate, there are those from the so-called non-Western world who may well make the argument that there is nothing redeeming about Western modernity, that the entire project is flawed, it is one of violence, it is one of iniquity, it is one of injustice, it is one of hypocrisy. Of course, as we are all gathered here speaking in English, I will, of course, reserve any judgment on taking things that drastically. We have to, of course, be more selective than in looking at what is the project of Western modernity. And in that, I'd like to look then at what were the systemic flaws. Was there something that made Western modernity doomed from the beginning? Well, if that's the case, then we have to wonder, why has it had a fairly successful 5 centuries long history of power and authority and influence that, of course, is also affecting all of us tonight? Or do we look at it from the standpoint that it was not flawed, and this was just simply a matter of opportunism, exploitation of others, then taking it into a direction that was never intended? So with that, let's go ahead and first explore, what do we mean by Western modernity here? And as I said before, The simplest definition of it is the state of being modern, meaning that what it is hopefully providing is something that improves upon what came before it. And the reason why the definition is so ambiguous, or seems so ambiguous, is because it's difficult to go ahead as human beings and escape from this whole idea of a chronological timeline. We are, of course, on the one hand, living a lifespan that has a birth, that has an ascension, and then ultimately it goes to our own decline and death. Societies act in this way, empires act in this way, and civilizations act in this way. They all have a chronology, and they all follow this particular positionality. And we all, of course, try to convince ourselves, persuade ourselves, and live lives that, at the expense of sounding philosophical here, move toward an improvement. We are hardwired to consider our lives to be meaningful if we are better today than we were yesterday. There has to be that kind of trajectory. And as such, we ourselves are examples of being modern. We like to see ourselves as moving in a positivistic direction from perhaps a less modern to a more modern state. Well, the reason why this definition is also then a little bit nebulous is because modernity, especially Western modernity here, is defined by its characteristics. Now, if we were to look at Islam, which I think would also be a very interesting lecture series about Islam as a project of modernity, I think that there are certain features that we could go ahead and say define how Islam was modern. The fact that it was singular in being able to unify a rather disunified Arabian Peninsula. The fact that it was able to provide more emancipatory and more egalitarian modes of living than was the system under the Quraysh and under polytheistic tribal Arabia before it. It was a society which then was able to succeed in expansion in a way that was seen as unprecedented. It was a society that brought a movement away from tangible tribal society toward a transcendental allegiance to a city-state like Medina. First time it had ever been done in history in that way, a constitution of Medina. So we could ascribe certain characteristics to Islam being modern in that way. But here, our focus, of course, in this lecture series is looking at Western modernity. And what are therefore the characteristics by which the West would say, this is what made us modern, and this is what keeps us modern. The rise of the nation state, the growth of tolerance as a political and social belief, industrialization, mercantilism and capitalism, colonization, representative democracy, science and technology, urbanization, mass literacy, mass media, and a distrust, if you will, based on René Descartes and Immanuel Kant of tradition in favor of autonomous reasoning. Well, if we were to compare this to the Islamic project, I think we could see quite a few things that they have in common. Certainly the growth of tolerance, mercantilism and capitalism was already thriving. There was discovery, but not colonization. There was representative government in the form of shura. There was, of course, a tremendous amount of science and technology 1,000 years ago. There was urbanization. There was improved literacy, relatively speaking, and the idea that tradition was not so calcified, it was not so rigid, that one could not explore new ideas and new trajectories. But a lot of those things that you see on this list, which I did not mention as having anything in common with the Islamic project at the time Islam became modern in the 7th century, so to speak, were ones that weren't required in the Islamic context. The rise of the nation state. There was no industrialization. It was far too premature for that. There was no mass literacy in the world before the 15th century because of mechanisms like the movable printing type of Johannes Gutenberg. Mass media is, of course, also a fairly recent development. So I think it's important to then realize, especially as Muslims and the Islamicate in general, is typecast as being backward, is typecast as being irredeemable, and as typecast as being incompatible with modernity. I think the very important response to that is saying that Islam has always been compatible with its own modernity. As far as the imposition of Western modernity, in some ways, perhaps Islam was already too modern to then have to accommodate Western tropes of modernity. Or on the other hand, perhaps it would have been better if Western modernity did not come to the Islamicate in the kind of imposition, violence, and coercion in which it did. So as we look then to shrink this list to a list that you probably are familiar with because we've been speaking about this in the other two lectures, what are the characteristics of how the West sees its own modernity? A market economy, a vibrant public sphere of discussion and deliberation and debate, democracy, a self-governing people, as Charles Taylor has said, these three characteristics. But adding into this, particularly after the French Revolution, secularism, and then liberalism, and by this we mean the assertion, primacy, and maybe the exclusiveness of individual rights. So now let's go ahead and see this list, which on the surface do not appear to be problematic. They do not appear to be in many ways inimical or hostile to Islamic values and Islamic vision for creating a functional society. Well, here's where we now have some of the issues. Today, the Western world, and by extension, the global, is dominated by what we call neoliberalism. And according to Naomi Klein, neoliberalism has three standard features. The privatization of the public sphere, meaning everything now is up for sale, everything is corporatized, everything is now in the hands of entrepreneurs and capitalists. The second is the deregulation of the corporate sector and the demand by corporations for it to be deregulated by governments. And then the lowering of income and corporate taxes, which are then paid for, interestingly enough, with either cuts to public spending or with full buy-in from the public. Well, if we consider then one of the standard features or the defining features of Western modernity to be market economies, to be a kind of capitalism which the West itself had characterized as being laissez-faire, let the markets decide, no intervention of any kind. We have to ask ourselves, is the West playing by its own rules? Is it being loyal? Is it being allegiant to the rules that it has set itself? After all, Adam Smith, as best as I can recall, is not Muslim. Neither was Edmund Burke, and neither were some of those who came as respondents to free market capitalism, people like Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, and even more recently, Thomas Piketty, etc. So when we're looking then at the shifting of the goalposts, we have to then look at what was the circumstances, what was the causation. And here, when it comes to neoliberalism, the two major drivers of that are fairly recent in Western modern history. Margaret Thatcher in the United Kingdom and Ronald Reagan in the United States. This idea that the former model of social welfare that helped the West in particular and the world more broadly make its way through the Great Depression of 1929 and the early 1930s, that there was no longer a need for a social welfare program provided by the government. Now we were going to have it left to the devices of human beings to then go ahead and create a kind of capitalism, except here was the problem. Whenever the corporations needed to be bailed out, the government was there. Well, the government is, especially in Western democracies, supposed to be for the people, by the people, and of the people. And at the very least, it is functioned by two things. One is the people's vote, and the other is the people's money through taxes. And so we find then that it was through no fault of individuals and the public, the bailing out of corporations, despite the fact that they had created these moral hazards by overextending themselves without any kind of accountability. So we have to then understand that when it comes to the ideal of a market economy, where human beings were at least potentially able to use reciprocity, the idea that we will do unto others how we expect to be treated, that no longer exists within the economy. And it's interesting to see how this has impacted, particularly thanks to colonialism and thanks to resources in both Muslim and non-Muslim regions, further income inequality and further power differentials. And here is a way that we can understand then the inconsistencies of how the West itself regards its own defining feature of market economy, something like a war. When it becomes beneficial, regulation to economies is going to go ahead and favor those who are loyal to Western, modern, democratic regimes. Those who fall ill of that then are going to be subject to some rather painful sanctions. And it's not just limited to the Muslim world, it is sometimes even something visited on so-called allies, which shows something else about this entire feature, is the amorality of the Western modern model, that nothing is quote unquote sacred in the name of economics. So France could be threatened with trade sanctions because of their desire to sit out of the Second Gulf War in 2003 against Iraq. Yet other countries that seem to be willing or opportunistic are going to be rewarded for it. That's not exactly what was intended by people like Adam Smith and the whole notion of a Western modern economy. Well, another feature, as I mentioned, about how the West defines being modern is having a vibrant public sphere. Well, a vibrant public sphere suggests that the marketplace of ideas should be open to everybody, and that if there is an issue, that the market will decide, that hopefully enough people will go ahead and reject a position, an ideology, an opinion, a movement, which is considered to be hostile to the betterment of society. And part of the problem with this stated objective is the way that it is actually applied. And here are two examples. On the right is the French quote unquote satirical magazine Charlie Hebdo. I'm sure many of you are familiar with it and the controversies around it, and specifically with their treatment of Islam and prophetic imagery, as well as that of Muslims and even the Quran. Charlie Hebdo claims that nothing is sacred. They will go ahead and make fun of anything and anybody. But two things. One is they seem to have a particular obsession with Islam and a particular venom at Islam. There are people and there are figures that are off limits. You will not find Charlie Hebdo, for example, I believe, making fun of the Holocaust or Queen Elizabeth II. So they do have restraints, which of course are very self-selective. This image of Charlie Hebdo on the right, saying Charlie Hebdo, Islam, religion de paix. This is actually after the Barcelona, Spain incident where a Muslim driver plowed through a crowd and dozens of people were killed and injured. This was the Charlie Hebdo response by mockingly saying, well, this is Islam as a religion of peace, but here's the proof to the opposite. One of the reasons why I picked this image, quite frankly, is it was the least offensive cover that I could find of Charlie Hebdo addressing an issue of Islam. The others were just really quite toxic. But what was interesting was that Iran, around this time, decided to challenge and confront Western modernity and Western societies to see whether they were consistent, whether they were hypocritical, whether they were contradicting their own stated values. And in 2015, they decided to host a contest to draw cartoons regarding the Holocaust. And what was interesting is that it was not a direct parallel, because the Holocaust, quite obviously, was a historical event. It was not going down to the theological foundations of Judaism as a religion, whereas Charlie Hebdo makes routine disparaging covers and depictions of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, of the Quran, not to mention Muslims as well, in very racist and bigoted terminology and depiction. So it was an effort to then hold the mirror up to the West to see whether it would accept, if you will, Iran's efforts to have free speech. And of course, the condemnations came quite quickly and quite reflexively that Iran was engaged in speech that was unacceptable and intolerable. So again, just to show how speech and how expression, despite how the West had defined it really open in an open-ended way, isn't the case. And to understand a lot of the hijab controversies in places like France and Switzerland, the notion of freedom of expression, which would otherwise seemingly legitimize and permit women to wear the hijab, the niqab, the burqa, is something that is not practiced. And in fact, quite the opposite, it is outlawed in these societies. Similarly, another feature of Western modernity is democracy. And yet today, we see two examples where democracy is actually under threat. In the United States, there has been a Supreme Court ruling a few years ago, which severely restricted what would have been seen as, again, a hallmark feature of Western democracy, the promotion of democracy, the facilitation, making it easier for people to exercise their democratic rights to vote. And yet here we find that with the curtailment of the US Voting Rights Act, something which was enacted in 1965 in the aftermath of the passage of the Civil Rights Act, as an essential way to guarantee particularly the voting rights of minorities. Now this is being challenged. What would have been, for lack of better words, seen as a sacred piece of legislation is no longer seen that way. And in the United Kingdom, similarly, we now have protests regarding the UK Nationality and Borders Bill. The fact that the UK can, the Home Office, strip someone of citizenship for conduct which would be regarded as incompatible with British values. Notice the ambiguity of this. Arguably, that means if somebody made fun of the Prime Minister, that would be enough. And worse, that that one's citizenship could be stripped without any due process, any recourse for an appeal. All that is required, according to the British law, is that if the individual can claim citizenship in another country, i.e. Bangladesh or Pakistan, then the British can go ahead and strip them of UK citizenship, because the law does say that no one can be stateless. Well, that means that, of course, for the majority population of people who are white Anglo-Saxon Protestant in Great Britain, they, of course, would not have a second citizenship, and therefore they would not be affected, even if they did something which fell afoul of the law. The British government would not be able to then strip them of their British citizenship. Of course, it would be very interesting to see if they did that for someone who had Canadian, Australian, New Zealand, or American citizenship, if they would be as bold to go ahead and strip them of their UK citizenship. So we see then that democracy is being challenged, and the whole notion of liberal democracy is starting to give way to what we see as illiberal democracy. And the CNN commentator and columnist Fareed Zakaria, a few years ago, explored this idea about whether Western democracies were becoming less liberal. So certainly this has been a debate for some time. Now there's another element to how the West regards democracy. Irrespective of how it is treating it within its own borders, the West has had a very, very dubious history with the promotion of democracy elsewhere. And last time we talked about, of course, colonialism. And colonialism was an effort to go ahead and disempower and disenfranchise people around the world from having their own choice, their own determination about their futures, politically and otherwise. There are four basic ways that the West could operate when it comes to democracy. It could either actively promote it, it could passively promote it, it could passively try to restrict it, or it could actively try to restrict it. And despite, of course, the rhetoric of being champions of democracy, it seems as though the Western modern project has been, as a whole, one that has suppressed democracy either passively or actively for several centuries now. And it is something that continues to this day. We find, of course, examples where pro-democracy movements, the political dissent, particularly against authoritarian regimes, totalitarian regimes, are routinely crushed, or at least are helped in their being crushed by Western governments. Starting in the 1960s, there was a movement called neoconservatism. And here, at least the attitude was to promote democracy and, if need be, force the promotion of democracy through intervention in international affairs, the whole notion of peace through strength. This was particularly leveraged during the end of the Cold War because of the neoconservative movement that hated communism and political radicalism. In 1968, there was an awful lot of agitation around the time of the Vietnam conflict of anti-war movements, which also had empathy for Soviet regimes around the world. And it was interesting to see that leading up to particularly the 1990s and the motivation stated for getting rid of a dictator like Saddam Hussein in Iraq was this promotion of democracy. Of course, underlying that particular ouster was corporate interests in oil and the idea of trying to reshape the world in ways that democracies were more indebted, dependent, and reliant on Western democracies. Where there was any kind of hesitation among those democracies to kiss the ring, so to speak, of the West, they were living a very short shelf life. So again, something to go ahead and consider when we're looking at these movements in the name of Western modern values like democracy. Here is a map of democracies in the Muslim world. And this is, of course, by gradation. The lighter the blue, the more democratic are the regimes. The darker, meaning in black, the less democratic that they are. And it's really interesting, if you were to take a look at this map, which countries are ones that are either actively supported by the West. Here we see Saudi Arabia and Oman and the United Arab Emirates and Qatar and Bahrain. And then we have, of course, other countries which the United States has destabilized, as has the West in general, like Libya and Chad and Sudan and Afghanistan. We also have here Turkmenistan, Kyrgyzstan, and Uzbekistan as well. But those countries which are generally left to their own devices, like Indonesia, Malaysia, somehow or the other have fared okay within all of this. So definitely something for you to keep in mind about what is the connection between Western democracy promotion and, ironically, Muslim democratic suppression. Where is the nexus there? Are any of these simply coincidental, or is it something to explain the inconsistency, the contradiction, and even the hypocrisy of it? Here is a sterling example of where democracy was actively subverted. Mohammed Mosaddegh was elected in 1951 to be the Prime Minister of Iran. He was from the center-left party, the National Front Party. And one of the first acts that he then conducted when he became Prime Minister was to enforce the Nationalization Act of 1950, which then nationalized the Iranian oil industry, which at that time was supposedly in a partnership with the British at the Anglo-Iran Oil Corporation in Abadan, but essentially that was a city-state that was being run by the British in the same way as the British East India Company had been in India. That, of course, was unacceptable to the West, particularly Churchill in Great Britain, and then ultimately Eisenhower in the United States. And in 1953, the CIA from the US and the MI6 from Great Britain, the intelligence services, staged a coup d'etat by removing Mossadegh from power and reinstalling their puppet regime in power, who was the last Shah, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi. And it was this incident in Iran that emboldened the West to realize that when it came to economics and when it came to their defined strategic interests, they could with impunity remove democratically elected officials if they weren't willing to toe the line to Western interests. The following year in 1954, the removal of Arbenz, who was the democratically elected president of Guatemala. In 1961, the execution after coup of Patrice Lumumba in the Congo, Kwame Nkrumah in Ghana, Salvador Allende in Chile in 1973. So the notion of being a democratically elected leader meant that you might, in fact, have a higher likelihood of being overthrown than being even a dictator who, like Pahlavi, was willing to be on side with Western needs. Of course, thanks to a popular uprising from within Iran, he was ousted in 1979 to be replaced by Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini and the Islamic Republic of Iran ever since. Here we see another example of the projection and promotion of democratic values, Operation Iraqi Freedom, a very interesting title to the entire mission in 2003. And we see the conquest by the burning oil fields, and we see the espousal of liberation, if you will, in the Abu Ghraib prison in Iraq by a US military man as well. So again, for those who are living on the receiving end of these kinds of actions, they are going to be very skeptical about not only Western modernity in the abstract, but also Western modernity as it is applied and as it is experienced by them. Here we see an example of the rather brutal civil war, if you will, or the French suppression of the independence movement in Algeria from 1954 to 1962. Despite the French mantra of liberty, equality, and fraternity, that apparently didn't apply to Algerians or Moroccans or Tunisians. Here we see literally a man on one knee having a conversation with the founder of Saudi Arabia, Abdulaziz Al Saud, on board a US naval vessel, which was parked or docked in the middle of the Suez Canal in 1945. To the right is US President Franklin Roosevelt, who had just attended the Yalta Conference with Churchill and Stalin to start to plan for the end of World War II and its aftermath. And here we find that instead of coming straight home, he made a very important pit stop to meet with King Saud in order to confirm and fortify oil contracts for American petroleum companies, including the Standard Oil Company of California. The man on his knee is not proposing marriage. He is, in fact, the translator. But you see how affable King Saud feels comfortable, how President Roosevelt is leaning in. And mind you, only a few weeks after returning home after this meeting, Roosevelt himself died of a stroke. So the fact that this meeting, despite the fact that he was probably already in failing health, shows not only the importance of the economics, but the willingness of the United States to deal with a regime that was an absolute monarchy, not quite a democracy by any stretch. Yet another feature of Western modernity, one which they insist is such a critical feature, is secularism. This whole idea that the public space should be free of religious difference. So much so that here you see an example of a woman on the left who would not be able to wear that headscarf in school. There is a ban on religious symbols for all faiths in France. President Emmanuel Macron has even suggested to bar foreign educated and trained imams, and that it would be up to the French state to educate and train Muslim imams on what to say and how to say it to their congregations in France. I think by some measure that would make Macron a caliph, not a president. But notice the contradiction between a society which is ferocious in its ideas of discharging laïcité, meaning secularism, a militant form, that they would then limit people from going to school simply for what they were wearing on their heads. And yet at the same time, how do we then reconcile that with what happened 3 years ago with the iconic, Cathedral de Notre Dame in Paris going up in flames? What was interesting about this was initially there was a lot in social media that was trying to put the blame on Muslims, had nothing to do with it, but also that despite the fact that France loves to project itself as this militantly secular country, when the cathedral was on fire, all of a sudden the building became no longer just a tourist site. It became someplace holy. It became someplace sacred to French society. And the solicitation for what ended up being close to $2 billion in contributions for its restoration. Trying to understand that contradiction, that inconsistency, is not just something as simplistic to say that France is racist against Muslims. Well, it is. But here what we see is, as far as its own projected and professed values, the dichotomy between how they view secularism as an abstract term and how they live it. France may be officially and institutionally a secular country, but culturally, there is no hesitation, there is no ambiguity that it is still a Christian country and a very Catholic Christian country. The symbolism everywhere, the state recognition of Christmas still, despite being a secular country, shows then that for the West, or for Western modernity, cultural religious foundation, irrespective of the promotion of secularism, is really what matters. For them, it is the idea that religion or religious authority was conquered thanks to the Protestant Reformation that we discussed in the first lecture. And now that Europe is liberated from the religious authority as being its only authority, it can go ahead and rest easy that if ever it needs to go back to a feeling of its own identity reassurance, it can do so because religion, or Christianity in particular, is protected as a defining cultural feature in Western modern life. Here we see, of course, then, an issue dealing with the last of the criteria that we were discussing, that being of liberalism, human rights, individuals' rights. And we have seen a slow erosion of individual rights, civil liberties, and civil rights, particularly over the last 20 years or so. And this is the case whether it is in the United States or in Europe or the UK. It is without any irony, and it is also without any coincidence that this has happened thanks to a lot of work that was focused on Muslim communities. Remember, in the United States, in the aftermath of 9/11, the passage of the USA Patriot Act, the idea of mass surveillance, the idea of tech companies working with governments to surveil the population. All of these were, again, not by accident. What was something that perhaps is now coming as a shock to so many in the West is waking up to the idea that the targeted community, at the time that the justifications were made for deviating from professed Western modern values of liberalism and individual rights, was the fact that people thought this was only going to apply to Muslims. So the individual rights of Muslims, or to put it another way, liberalism could have boundaries and limitations as long as it was to somebody else. Well, Muslims, in fact, in the West became canaries in the coal mine. For those of you who may not be familiar with that metaphor, coal miners would lower a cage with a canary in it down the mine shaft in order to test to make sure there were no toxic fumes that were developing as a result of the coal mining, in particular carbon monoxide, which is lethal. If the canary came back dead when they brought it back up, that meant that the mine was too dangerous for human beings to go down. If the canary lived, then they would send the miners down. And in many ways, it seems as though Muslims were that canary in the coal mine to test what broader society would accept when it came to a deviation from its own stated Western modern values. Chief among those, of course, as we have discussed, was liberalism and individual rights. Now it seems as though, in the name of either curtailing terrorism, foreign influence, or a myriad other reasons, the government has accepted that they can go ahead and limit people's individuals' rights without any accountability or without having any possible punitive action taken against them. So it's important to see then, as we've gone through this list, market economy, the public sphere, democracy, secularism, and individual rights, the systemic flaws within the Western application of its own values, values that it has defined itself. How that, of course, played out with the Islamicate, well, quite frankly, there was no concern about the contradiction because nobody was holding the West accountable to those particular contradictions. Now, today, the question to ask ourselves is whether Western modernity is at a crossroads. There are many debates occurring. There are many conversations about whether the West is going to remain in the position that it is and has enjoyed for several centuries. Part of that, of course, has to do with the rise of China and Asia as a whole. And it brings about a very interesting inflection point that one would think that if one wanted to confront the new and rising superpower, economically dominant, militarily dominant China, that it would make sense to provide an even starker and sharper contrast to China, to go ahead and make the argument and the claim that there is something still superior about Western modernity, that its values are ones that are better, more universal, perhaps even more eternal than anything that China would have to offer. That believing in those concepts, applying those concepts, projecting and supporting those concepts elsewhere would then serve as a vital firewall against the rising spread of Chinese influence around the world. Except what we're finding, of course, is something quite different. The notion of free market economies is starting to give way to a lot of hacks, a lot of manipulations, tariffs, sanctions, something that we don't see really happening with China. We see, of course, the erosion of liberal democracy in favor of illiberal democracy, curtailment of voting rights, curtailment and threats to citizenship rights, the idea that secularism does not recognize multicultural, multi-faith societies and serves to try to punish those who dare to engage in such activities. Interestingly, discouraging immigration, both by law and regulation, but also by disincentivizing people to move to the West because of the way that they treat people from other parts of the world and of other persuasions and faiths, at a time when the birth rate in the West is so low that their own economic model is under threat of collapsing if there are not more immigrants brought in order to then prop up the economy, especially when it is facing challenges from competitors and rivals like China. So we're now at this point where, as we look at Western modernity and we look at its values and we look at the application of those values both outside and within the West, we have to be asking these questions. What next? How is this going to impact Muslims living in the West? How is it going to affect Muslims living elsewhere? Because when the West sneezes, it is not just going to impact the West. The splash zone, so to speak, is going to have a ripple effect in many different areas. And inshallah, next time, we will also go ahead and explore that very topic. But for now, I welcome any questions that you have regarding modernity in the West and its systemic flaws. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Saeed, for the presentation. I'm sure our audience have enjoyed it and they're ready for the Q&A section. Again, dear audience, please feel free to raise your hands and volunteer yourself for the questions. We'll be really happy with that. But let me start with my one, Saeed, if you don't mind me asking and starting. I'm really glad that you mentioned about the issues and problems of modernity, and also you pointed out the fallacies of democracy as well. But you know, you mentioned about the racial issues in France and Muslim community in particular. So if I look into at the very back, at the very root of the problem that France is having with its minority communities, I guess all of it goes back to the very foundational idea of modernity. Because when I go back to the history, how the modernity has came into being, I see that as Bill Ashcroft described it, that modernity went hand in hand with colonialism, transatlantic slavery, destruction of artifacts in the colonized lands through archiving, cartography, archaeology, ethnography, and so forth. And colonial Spanish Guatemala is an example. So can these acts be justified in the name of civilizing and modernity?
No, absolutely not. I mean, first of all, usually if somebody is in need of change, it would be their well, it wouldn't be their responsibility, it would be their right to go ahead and ask for help. In the case of colonization, as you mentioned, particularly as it was applied through what's known as white man's burden, the civilizing process was not for the benefit of the colonized. Certainly it wasn't primarily for that reason. It was for the benefit of rationalizing what this entire project was about. It was done under the cover of missionary work, where the religious, the clergy and the church could find a way to go in. And remember, there was an incentive to do so. If the church went in and started to quote unquote civilize the native population, they were going to then have access to the population's resources. And essentially the church was going to get a cut of that. So there was a tremendous amount of financial potential that the church had to gain. And remember that this was happening at a time when half of Christendom was leaving the church thanks to the Protestant Reformation. So economics was playing a massive role in trying to then provide a replacement for the funding. And I know it seems so tragic to reduce this to economics, to think that millions upon millions of lives perished, were uprooted, dislocated, deracinated, all because somebody needed more money. But in many ways, that's really what that entire episode came down to. The other point, Naeem, that you're making regarding colonialism is, remember, this entire Western modern project was something that was conceived, contrived, controlled, and then crafted by the West. This didn't involve other people's input. And so the West then, in order to stay Western or to expand and be powerful, they then created all of these mechanisms in order to do that. We need colonization. We have industrialization now. We need more colonization, or a different kind, to exploit resources. There's nothing free market about that. It was just simply exploiting other people. And perhaps at the foundation of that is, how do we reconcile liberalism, which with its value on the individual, humanism, if you will? Well, it's simple. When you don't regard the colonized people, the occupied people, the subjugated people as even being human beings, then you realize that they are as exploitable as any other commodity that happens to be there, whether it is grain or gold or anything else. Now, in the case of France, what you have to realize is that when they entered their post-colonial period, the wheels came off the wagon. They had to exit Indochina in '54 in real and utter humiliation. And then they had this entire thing happening in North Africa. Just to give you an example, Algeria was, unlike other colonies in the French Empire, those were controlled by the foreign ministry. Algeria was controlled by the home ministry. They regarded it as a province, not as a colony. And so when Algeria is lost in 1962, when they finally get their independence, France never recovered from that. To this day, it has not recovered from that. And some of the great French philosophers of the last 60 years, people like Foucault, people like Jean-Paul Sartre and his partner Simone de Beauvoir, people like Lyotard, Baudrillard, the architects of postmodernism, they were all traumatized because for them, they're trying to reconcile French and more broadly Western modern values with the way that the French prosecuted the Algerian crisis. They said this is completely contradictory to any of those steps and any of those values and virtues that have been created. So what we're finding today in France comes down to a very important moment in Western modernity that you see in places like Great Britain, in France, in the European Union as a whole, in the United States. This is all an identity crisis. As the West had been self-defining for a long time, now it finds that it can no longer rely upon those definitions. It either has to reformulate them or it has to live by them and realize that others perhaps are doing a better and more effective job with the landscape that they have created.
Thank you, Professor Saeed. I don't want to hold up other people. I saw Kamal, you raised your hand and perhaps you lowered it down for some reason. Please go ahead and make your question, Kamal. Okay, so right, let's go to Dr. Ali Ahmed Shoaib, and then Kamal, I'll come back to you next. Okay, Dr. Shoaib.
Assalamu alaikum. Thank you very much for such a informative talk there and very well structured talk, Dr. Saeed. I wanted to sort of ask you maybe a slight mute point, but just for a clarification, really, how you see it. And you started the whole discussion.
Sorry, Ali, you muted yourself.
Apologies. Yeah. So you discuss about the issue of modernity as being there's a lot of similarities between, if you were to look at the structure of modernity and what is different definition of modernity, and linking it, sort of saying Islam at that time when it ran a state was also a modern state. It ticked most of the boxes of what you term as modernity. You fulfilled. There was rise in X, Y, and Z. Conditions, including sort of trade and people. I mean, you had a nice list at the beginning that you listed, and you said, I think 5 or 6 of those were easily fulfilled by Islamic society as well. Now, coming on to the issue of the contradictions that you've sort of listed, the word liberalism, democracy, and secular or neoliberalism you've actually used as a term. Neoliberalism, these are now more used as a form of a way of life and a way of political ideology, really, that is pushed quite heavily. But just the word ideology as a concept, as a definition. I mean, if I just had a quick look at sort of how ideology is defined online, and to be honest with you, apart from the Western ideology and maybe socialism and fascism being part of the isms of ideology, there is no sign of Islam in the scene as an ideological alternative or an existing ideology, even as an ideological thought in the world of ideologies. So I'm just asking, because using the yardstick of democracy, which is exclusively, really, I would say, a Western, that yardstick is exclusively applicable to capitalism as an ideology. Democracy, democratic value, people rule, the rule of the people, by the people, for the people, is I would argue, an exclusively sort of a secular sort of capitalist, within the capitalist framework of political ideology. That yardstick itself, when you apply it to other ideologies, other ways of looking at society, probably falls short of these standards. So the inconsistencies in behavior that you've listed, for instance, secular democracy being inconsistent towards its own people, the issue of sort of political voice, opposition, this is, could that be reflective of the contradiction of the ideology, an ideology that is considered to be man-made. And when it comes to the inconsistency towards others like Muslims, could it be that it is because the ideology is self-preserving and therefore does not wish another ideology to come on the scene and take over? So the two inconsistencies, one towards its people, I would argue that is actually the inconsistency, the contradictions within ideology. And therefore, I think the people who propose something like this should look at the ideology carefully and say, actually, is it truly something of a savior to mankind? And when it comes to other societies, Muslim majority, since we are talking about Muslim majority, could it be that, you know, we shouldn't be surprised? We shouldn't be surprised when America, Britain behaves in a particular way in the Muslim land, you know, and you fantastic example you gave where, you know, the most Western democratic promotion usually we find there's a direct correlation, you know, reverse correlation with the most democratic suppression countries. Basically, they're the ones that they have the cahoots with. And the beautiful picture you've given with the founder of Saudi Arabia and the US president says it all. You know, picture speaks 1,000 words. That is exactly what was there before and what it is now, and we're seeing it on a regular basis. So do you think that's a useful distinction to make, to be able to see, because there were a lot of examples you quoted, and sometimes the inconsistency towards own people are lost, you know, within. So I'm living in the UK. As a UK citizen, I will see there is certain anti-people activity that the UK government may make, and I will feel strongly about that. But as a Muslim, as a separate identity that I have, when I see their behavior towards Muslim countries, I see that as more towards their, you know, sort of self-preservation, you know, in order to make sure that another way of life doesn't come to existence. Sorry for sort of making a bit too elaborate, but
No. And thank you, Jazakallah, so much for that. I mean, I fully agree with you. And I would argue that for the Western engagement with the Muslim world, so to speak, outside its own precinct, its ideology is economics, for lack of better terms. The decision-making about whether or not it decides to be deferential toward totalitarianism, authoritarianism, is based on, you know, Peter Berger talks about plausibility structures as being things that then help to provide functionality and stability for societies. And for the West, in its dealings with Muslim countries and others outside the West, its greatest litmus test or barometer for plausibility structures is stability. And if that means working with a despot, if it means working with a tyrant, an authoritarian regime, that's it. It is inconvenient to consider these platitudes and this rhetoric of human rights and democracies and whether women drive or not. That's all, as I get again, bluster that is created. I hope I didn't misspeak earlier. I hope I didn't make the implication that Islam ever was a state. The notion of the state, and particularly the modern nation state, is a very recent development. I was part of a conversation, in fact, just about 2 hours ago, where a very noted scholar who also studies Islam made the point that she wouldn't even regard Rome, ancient Rome, to be a state. So just to go ahead and say that, and I think your point is extremely important to realize that when we're looking at the architecture around which concepts like Western modernity develop, you cannot take the nation state out of that model. You cannot take democracy. This is all like a big puzzle, and all of these pieces help define Western modernity. And I think it also then provides for, and inshallah we'll cover this next time, what if one of those pieces is no longer there? Does it mean that Western modernity will as a whole collapse or morph into something else? Or will it be able to move forward with a kind of an evolution of that? And that's a big open question. We don't know what's going to happen. If you think about all of the different ways that the West has tried to reinvent itself, in many ways to justify itself, the European Union. I mean, the European Union, I think, is a fantastic example of people who would be willing to abdicate their own national identity for economic power and stability to match that of the United States and to match that of a rising China. And what ended up happening? It only deferred the existing systemic flaws, vulnerabilities, weaknesses, contradictions, and arguments among these. I'll just give you one example because I think it's germane. A few years ago, I had a chance to meet with Frans Timmermans, who I believe is the European Union culture minister and one-time vice president of the EU. He's Dutch. He came to Detroit, and EU MPs are always fascinated with Detroit because they want to see how Muslims and Arabs live here in their natural habitat, almost like they're coming to visit a zoo. And so Timmermans asked the very patronizing question, why is it that the Muslims here seem to be so docile? I mean, again, using zoological language. And I said, well, part of it is because they're given space. They are considered to be fully American, which is something that Europeans don't necessarily confer upon them. And I said, also, they don't have an identity crisis. And I said, I would suggest that not only are Muslims dealing with an identity crisis of their own because they don't know where they stand in Europe, but you're not making it easier because you have your own identity crisis. And he was quite shocked that I said that. He says, I don't have an identity crisis. I said, let's put this to a test. I said, would you mind telling me how much money you have in your wallet? And so he takes his wallet out and he says, well, I've got about 150 US dollars and I have about 150 euros. And I said, no guilders? And he started laughing. He says, I haven't had guilders in my wallet in 15 years. I said, well, that's the problem, isn't it? And he says, what's the problem? I said, you're no longer Dutch, you're European. Except every now and then you default to being Dutch when it comes to the Olympics and the World Cup, you know, Holland hop. And he understood that Europe is caught between the national and the post-national. And so here again, you find that if you take people away from those anchors that they themselves defined, we, unfortunately, as Muslims who live in the West, and those who, of course, are living outside the Muslim world, but have to deal with the West because of its dominance currently, it's like living in a home where the parents don't provide stability. Either they're arguing amongst themselves, or they're having financial problems, or one of them is having an affair. Even in whatever efforts they have of trying to mask that from their children, the children know. And I would use that as the metaphor by which we're dealing with them. So thank you.
That's a very good one. Thank you.
Excellent.
Can I know, Nawfal, you've had your hand up. Just as a quick comeback, apologies. You know the issue of the nation state you mentioned?
Yes.
Could it be, and I agree with you, the word nation state is not really applicable to history of Islam, but that in the title, the Islamicate is probably more appropriate, whereas the borders were always expanding and moving. It never really defined itself purely in geography terms, but its adoption. And whereas the nation state being part of I would say to you, a modern day tribal identity. It's another form of tribal identity of nation states, to be able to say, I eat this way, I wear this, I talk this way, and I walk this way. That is my identity. And in a way, secular liberalism, capitalism really didn't have, because I think it failed to understand, I would argue, some of the fundamental needs of human cohesion, what actually brings human beings together as a society. And it's not just money, it's not just having a comfy house, but it's a little bit more than that. And that's where all of these were so even, the Brexit argument, if you look at how superficial it was, it sort of resulted back to that baseline human identity level of my little community, and that's it. When people stop thinking about the greater aspect of it. So I agree with you, but yeah, with the Muslims, they didn't really need that.
Right, but you see, here's the problem, and I don't think that the West really understands this on a conscious level. The tribalism now is actually at the corporate level. On the one hand, I mean, and this is one of the great paradoxes, if you will. that the West has created the corporate structure. And it is a corporate structure which not only then facilitated, but crafted globalization as we understand it today. And these corporations now work, on the one hand, without concern or care of borders, except when it suits their needs, that they need to have a sovereign state operate on their behalf. But if we are moving toward open borders, at the same time, we're still being forced into being tribal, that you're either an Apple person or you're a Samsung person, you're a Coca-Cola person, you're a Pepsi person. So then we're no longer citizens, we're morphing into consumers.
True.
The question, though, is that on the level of being a human being, as an individual, someone who has nafs, which gives us more rights? Which gives us more dignity? I mean, from an Islamic standpoint, those are critical questions. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Professor. I guess Kamal is waiting for a long time. Kamal, go ahead. Are you there, Kamal? Okay, right.
Can you hear me? Sorry, Assalamu alaikum.
Welcome, Salam.
First, I want to thank you all for a fantastic series and a very enlightening talk. I just wanted to come from a slightly different angle. I recently read a book called Culture and Anarchy by Matthew Arnold and another gentleman by the name of Edward Tyler, famous anthropologist who wrote about primitive cultures. These were famous Victorians that were part of this colonial exploit, where they propagated the Western ideas and they looked down upon the other. I think it also links to White Man's Burden and Rudyard Kipling's White Man's Burden. So where they sent people into the dark world or the brown world to exploit and take their goods. What impact do you think these founding fathers or the seminal pieces of work from Victorian or from European literature, what impact do you think it has today? The people like Matthew Arnold, Edward Tyler, Rudyard Kipling. What impact do you think it has? Because I personally feel that many educated persons in the West still carry these concepts as a result of these people, these anthropologists and so-called sociologists.
Yeah, thank you for that question. And apropos to it, this semester I'm co-teaching a course with a classics colleague of mine on Orientalism and Occidentalism in the Eastern Mediterranean. And one of the assignments that we had for our students was to watch the movie, the 1975 movie starring Michael Caine, Sean Connery, and Christopher Plummer, The Man Who Would Be King, based on a Rudyard Kipling short story. And I remember seeing the movie in a theater when I was 8 years old. And it was one of these glorious British Empire movie, a couple of rascals trying to make their way into Kafiristan in Afghanistan and seek their fortune during the time of British India. And it was Orientalist in four ways. Kipling himself was an Orientalist, born in British India. His short story was Orientalist. The adaptation of the story was Orientalist. And then the director, John Huston, was Orientalist, so much so, just to give you an example, that the movie is supposed to take place in Afghanistan. It was shot in Morocco. And the Gurkha, played by Saeed Jafari, is speaking in Urdu to Uta, who's speaking a Berber dialect of Moroccan Arabic. And the audience, of course, would be none the wiser for this. The idea that you can link the Maghreb to South and Central Asia deftly like that is just a real condescension of so much complexity and diversity. So the bad news is, I think, Kamal, that it does still have an effect. And it has an effect particularly in the more prestigious institutions of learning where this canon of classics is embedded in places like Eton, Harrow, Oxbridge, etc., that these are the reinforcing mechanisms to have not only the West, but those who study this literature because they feel they need to emulate it, be hardwired that way. The only good news is that the canon is no longer as obligatory as it once was. I've been teaching in the academy now for about 17 years, 18, I think now. And the number of people who read the so-called classics, those that would be so embedded in Orientalism, the primacy of the West over the dark continent and other people, is becoming less and less and less. I think it's still an open question to see, because these things usually happen on a generational level. So how long it would take before this presumption of superiority starts to decrease. You're already seeing this happening in Hollywood. There's a big debate about how China's influence is now a form of soft power. The movie The Martian, directed by Ridley Scott, starring Matt Damon, without trying to blow the plot for anybody who's seen it, it shows that it is the cooperation between the United States and China which then effectuates a successful outcome to the plot. So that kind of idea that now when things really get a bit of a challenge, that China to the rescue, that's a very powerful shift from only 45 years ago, when the only thing about China was kung fu movies and that kind of reductivism. So let's see where this goes. But thank you for that. I would like to just make a comment regarding Ms. Naomi Caligaro's comment in the chat. Thank you for that and for giving the insight about your family. Absolutely. There were some missionaries who were completely motivated by their conscience, and they did a lot of work. I would suggest for you that the experience of the missionaries here, as you're describing it in India, were markedly different from the missionary work in places like South America in the 16th century, where the Spanish and the Portuguese, when they took clergy there, it was by and large a very brutal process of deracination, exploiting the trust of the native population. One movie that actually shows a very nice angle to the complexities of this was from the 1980s, the movie The Mission, with Jeremy Irons and Robert De Niro.
The Mission.
The Mission. Have you seen it?
DVD now, because it's an old movie.
Yeah, I mean, I had a very wonderful encounter once flying from New York to London, where I was at the baggage claim at Heathrow at 6:30 in the morning, and the only other person standing there at the time, because we got done so quickly, was Jeremy Irons. And so I just had to say something to him, and I asked him if he'd watched himself on the flight over, because that show The Borgias was on. And he says, "Oh no, I was catching some sleep." And I said, and he said, "You?" I said, "No, I've seen it before, but actually I preferred you in some of your other stuff." And he says, "Oh really, like what?" I said, "Well, I think that really the defining role for you was The Mission." And he's like, "Oh my, I was much younger back then." And I said, "Well, so was I." But he was lovely. And in fact, he had just the most wonderful things to say about Islam and Muslims, and the most critical things to say about British society not appreciating the contributions of Islam and Muslims. And he did so in an unprovoked way. So when he found out what I do for a living. But yeah, that's my Jeremy Irons story. So thank you for that.
Saeed, I think Aziz Rahman is waiting for a while. Let's ask him to make his questions. Aziz Rahman, please.
Okay, thank you very much. I had to say some points before we started the just a few more on that one to get a sort of response to this one. One is that, just in a layman's way, I noticed that after the fall of Roman Empire, including the sort of Constantine, sort of the Byzantine side, I think Europe never became united. They were splintered, and they stayed in that way. And when they have got a science revolution, I would rather not call it a revolution of science. It is more like when their economic things started shaping up, it was a technological revolution, because science applied to develop technology, and that played a part in capitalistic competition. And then they say that this area has become too small for a competition, let us go outside to really loot the other people. But over there was something just crossed my mind, that in that effort to really go out of Europe, before that, they were also fighting between themselves. You can say Alsace-Lorraine fight between Germany and France, and Britain was cleverly sort of staying away from their inter-European fight. Yet, in the end, when they saw, even Britain I'm talking, when they saw Germany is becoming a real threat of the colonial possessions, that has eventually caused the two world wars, First World War and Second World War. But my point is that in all these things, the European powers has gone out to loot the rest of the world as like a tribe of tigers. When they were looting, there was a bit of, hey, he's looting more than me. So there was a bit of competition there. That's why French and British war in 1756 to 1963. And after that, they realized, no, there's no point of doing it. Let us go and loot ourselves. So in that way, I have said before that it is the economic interest or the looting interest that was the primary buttress for giving these people the power and ability and so project itself. And when they projected, they have given a false version of what they really are. They have not said, only now and then, Dr. Adkhan will agree with me, hopefully. I've heard that they use a word called vital interest. And they have said that that is what they're after. So I just go like geometric formula. Anywhere you decide what action they will take, which direction they'll go. In geometry, we studied, like in Euclidean geometry, like the two straight lines, etc. From there, all other sort of theorems, etc., will come and be solved. So in this world, as far as I can see, vital interest, and to achieve that vital interest, the hegemony, and hegemony is based on, as you just mentioned, on the economic superiority or economic wealth superiority, and using that to project their power. But as you mentioned before, that is really slowly and steadily crumbling from within. So I would like to know your opinion, Doctor. If it is showing that they are making this mistake, not mistake, deliberately, in application, they are distorting the same definition they came up with about 100 years ago. So what will be the Muslim people's understanding of the situation? In what way they will define their own policies? For example, Muslim world has accepted nation state, although they are not performing as a democracy, but that they have formed, like Saudi Arabia is also nation state ruled by monarch. Bangladesh is a sort of nation state, but ruled by a fascist. So in that way, but if we accept nation state in whatever way, what will be our formula to really come under Islamic banner? Is it a kind of United Nations of Muslims, or is it a united single empire on Muslims? These things have always wrecked my mind, because I believe that it will decline, because as I said before, the decline that has, the buttress that has helped European democracy and world power, the economic decline will also ultimately cause its decline and sort of going to secondary position. But what will be our format, political structure? What will be our economic? Even about economic, I would like to add, Doctor, I would like to hear your comment. Even capitalism and communism, I believe both are Western. They are not really, communism is not born outside West. Because Karl Marx was able to see that, the capitalism exploiting their people, so he come up with that. But even there, he is 50% correct or not correct, 50% reasonable, other bit he left it untouched. He made a critique of capitalism, but he did not give a solution how to deliver his desired class-based society. In the end, we got very much highly totalitarian one-party government in Soviet Russia and even in China, but they also did not succeed. And so there is a vacuum in which we are now living in all respects, and Western world is declaring what form our political structure, what form our economic thinking should take, so that we can play their role after they are inevitably going to be vacating this place or vacating the stage. Thank you.
Thank you for that. I do agree it's economics, and in short form regarding, and we can cover this inshallah in the next lecture session. I don't know what is necessarily going to succeed the conventional and current nation state model. I think it's an increasing question. I think though that what we have certainly seen right now is that it is not an eternal model. And I think that that is something that would probably have shocked a lot of people, especially in the West, to even hear articulated a few years ago. You know, the nation state is what, about 478 years old or something like that, from 1648 onwards. I mean, Islam is three times that amount of longevity. Christianity 4.5 times the length. So systems certainly show that the nation state doesn't have to be around forever, but what the next social political model will look like is really difficult to say at this time. You're right to go ahead and say that communism is a Western construct. It completely is, because Marx was commenting on and critiquing industrialization and capitalism as it was playing out in real time in the 19th century, when he wrote the Communist Manifesto, and when he wrote Das Kapital as well with Engels. And I think it's important for us to recognize that even those people who seem to be so critical of Marxism, there are those who I think venerate Marx almost to the point of deification or some kind of a prophet. But I think that what Marx was simply saying was, look, this is the world around you. I'm trying to explain it, and I'm offering a theory of where things might go. Now, the fact that some people took what he said and tried to apply it and didn't do a very good job, people like Lenin and others, meant that they didn't fully understand Marx. And quite frankly, they didn't fully understand their own society and whether it was ready for what Marx was envisaging. I mean, the reason why it didn't work in Russia is because Russia was not an industrialized country. It was still a predominantly agrarian country. So I think exercises like this, hopefully, then are the baseline, the preliminary work that we can then use in trying to then forecast what comes next and where do Muslims fit into that. People like to talk about the Ummah. People like to talk about some kind of large conglomerate. Well, is it even working on a small conglomerate? Let's look at the Gulf Cooperation Council. Qatar was for 3 years ostracized by bigger forces like Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates. The League of Arab States, not necessarily fully Muslim, but predominantly of 22 nations, is arguably one of the most dysfunctional and impotent NGOs out there, perhaps at the same level of efficiency and effectiveness, some would argue, as the OIC. Again, I mean, this is not meant to be a slur on any organization, but if we're looking at certain metrics of when there are proposals of ideas to look beyond the nation state within the Islamicate, I'm not sure that we have a very good record. And lastly, I would say that the nation state is something that came to the Islamicate by imposition. The borders for the nation states were drawn by others, and they are reinforced by others. There has never been a successful effort made by any Muslim countries that are adjacent to each other to go ahead then and renegotiate the borders between them. They don't even change the flags that were imposed by them by Lord Sykes, which is really sad, but that's a whole different discussion.
Thank you, Saeed. Actually, I appreciate Aziz Rahman and others' questions, but we are unable to take any more because we have gone over the allocated and planned time that we have actually planned. So again, with that, we are closing our session tonight. We thank Professor Saeed for delivering the lecture, and we also thank you all for joining us in this session and making valuable contributions in the questions and comments. Our next lecture will be on 24th February, Thursday, on the title of The Future of Modernity and Its Effects on the Islamicate. So more details will be shared shortly in our WhatsApp group, so please feel free to join in if you haven't done it yet. That's it for today and tonight. We hope to see you in our next lecture. With that, we are ending tonight. Thank you so much. Bye for now.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.